morning. My name is Sharon Townsend, and I'm connected with Women's Bible Study, small group, connections team, and of course reading. This morning we're going to be in Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, my name is Thompson, and I'm a pastor here at Calvary Bible Church, and we're progressing our way through the Old Testament storyline, and we left off in this period of the Israelites' history that is referred to by the leaders that they had, these tribal leaders called the Judges. And the period of Judges can pretty much be summed up with the phrase, "not quite." God promised to give them this land that would be their inheritance, where they would be with God and he would be with them as his people, that he would care for them and provide for them. And God had done all of that. But rather than this being a period of rest, it was marked by war and chaos and turmoil. God had raised up leaders to guide the people, but it wasn't quite in the way that all the people needed. God was working through them as he promised he would to bring about this plan, this rescue mission for all of the world to know that he is God. But Israel themselves continued to forget their God and turn away from him towards other false gods. And it's in this period that we continue to hear this longing for more, this desire that's reflected in this oft-repeated phrase throughout the book of Judges. It's even how the book of Judges ends. We read it last week, but this is Judges 21-25, and we're going to be jumping around the text quite a bit, so it's important to me that you have the text in front of you to see these aren't my words, this is coming from what God has said. If you need a Bible, we have them in the back on the table there, and this passage is found on page 261. Can't help you with where it's located in your Bible, but whatever you have, we are in Judges 21, verse 25, page 261 in the Bibles on the back. This is what the verse says, and it's found all throughout the book of Judges. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." This was a time where God was working through the Israelites, but it was so chaotic, so painful that people continued to sin, continued to turn away from God, and it just it's not pleasant to read. There's atrocities committed. It's chaotic. It's hard to read through the book of Judges. But it's often in these times that feels so hopeless, that feels like God is absent, that feels like we are lacking so much in life. That is when we can most clearly see the work of God, even if it turns out looking quite a bit different than what we expected it to. And that's what we see in the story of Ruth. From the very first verses of it, which you can get to by just turning one page over. Well, if you have a study Bible, there's probably introductory material. But either way, like right after this verse was said, we find out that Ruth takes place in this period, during the Judges. Against this dark, terrible backdrop, we see this story emerge where God works through his people to bring about fullness. Because it's when we look at the book of Ruth from this backdrop of pain and difficulty, where the judges are failing, where people are turning away, where everyone's just doing what's right in their own eyes, the story emerges that seems small in comparison, that just tracks through this family line. But even though things around them were falling apart, things around them were chaotic, that is not the end of the pain for this family. Because we read that Naomi and her family have to leave their home. They have to leave the promised land that God had entrusted to them because there was a famine in the land. And so they have to go to the nation of Moab. Now, maybe you've had great experiences in Moab, but it would not have been so great for the Israelites here. For one, the Moabites were one of their oldest and most consistent enemies, constantly warring against them, constantly enslaving Israelites. Not so long ago in the book of Judges, we read that's exactly what they did. But not only that, to be in Moab means that you would have been surrounded by their gods, their false idols that they worshipped, what God had strictly told them not to join in with. How could they possibly avoid that if they're living right in their land? But needs must. They need food, and so they go to this place of their enemies. And while they're there, Naomi's two sons marry Moabite women, which doesn't look so good on paper. But it's a reminder that God, strongly said not to marry outside of Israel, not because he was randomly picking and choosing nations that he did not like as much as Israel, but because of that very thing, that they were worshiping these false gods. And as you joined in with them in life, there was always that pull and always that reality of turning away from God. But that becomes the least of Naomi's worries, because while in Moab, her husband and then her two sons die. And that will always, always be an awful situation. But it's especially bad for Naomi where she finds herself. Because at the time, and this is merely me reporting history, at the time, women were unable to support themselves, unable to provide a life for themselves. Land ownership was predominantly male. The ability to generate an income from that land was predominantly male. And so a woman's sense of security and safety, of having a home and a future, was tied to being married. Or if their husband died, was tied to having a son or a son-in-law who could help support. But Naomi's lost all of that. She has no support system anymore. She has nothing, no way to care for herself, no way to find a meal, nothing. And that's why she tries to send her daughter-in-laws away. I can't support myself. How can I possibly support you as well? But Ruth, in an incredible step of faith in God, clings to her mother-in-law. Well, they head back to Israel, and there was at least one bit of provision that God had called for to care for the widows. What we see constantly in the love of God is God cares so deeply for those who are marginalized, those who are overlooked by society, those who do not have a support system. And so he called for his people, the Israelites, to not, when it comes to harvest season, to not harvest all of the field, but to leave the outside of the field unharvested. So those who cannot eat or cannot generate income, this could be orphans or widows or foreigners or refugees or whoever it might be, that they could have at least some sort of provision. That is God's care for the marginalized. But I mean, this is the time of Judges. This is when people are constantly turning away from what God calls people to do. This is when it's categorized by what we just read, that everyone is just doing what's right in their own eyes, let alone this bit of provision for outsiders. This is a time where Israel did not like outsiders. They were constantly oppressed and overruled by foreigners. So surely this plan to provide care, that's got to be the first thing to go, right? Well, we read of Naomi stepping out in faith, out of love for her mother-in-law as well, to see, is it possible to glean, to gather from the outside edges of these fields? Is it possible for her to find something to support both her and Naomi? Well, this is what we read in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. It says, so she, this is Ruth, set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz. So Naomi, against all odds, is able to find a place that she is able to glean, to gather food. That she happens to find a field where this man Boaz is trusting in what God commanded him to do. In a time when no one else was following God, here is this man Boaz who is remaining faithful. And Naomi happens to go to his field, the passage says. But not just that, she finds much more kindness and mercy from this man Boaz, who allows her to glean from the field, who actually invites her to join him and his people at like a lunchtime meal, and then afterwards is encouraging his workers to not do the best of job of harvesting, to pick things up and then drop it so it's easier for Ruth to find. Now, all along, just showing his mercy and kindness. I mean, what a great thing that she happened to go to his field rather than another. But those chances, the importance of how this happened to go, as the text says, is elevated all the more as we continue in the story. Because Ruth, after a whole day of gleaning, after picking up this food, ends up gathering enough to provide not just for that night's meal, but weeks worth of food for two people. It's incredible. So she goes back to her mother and Naomi, and she's understandably shocked. Where'd you get all this food? But her shock is nothing compared to what she hears from Ruth's mouth. She's like, well, I happened to go to a field belonging to Boaz. And it's almost like there's a double take here. Wait. Did you just say Boaz? Ruth 2, verse 20. It says, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may Boaz be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And Naomi said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. This person that you walked to their field, that you were gleaning from them, doesn't just happen to be one of the few faithful people in the time period of Judges. Doesn't just happen to be merciful in how he's treating you and treating me, but he happens to be one of our redeemers. So this is speaking of a practice at the time, another place of support that God provided for the marginalized. That in the event that a male died without having an heir, his widow would enter into something that was called levirate marriage. Now, it's a foreign concept to us, and it's a weird phrase to try to understand, so let me give a really crude and inappropriately brief summary of what this would have meant like, just so we can understand its significance in the story. So levirate marriage was this idea that if a husband died without producing an heir, that the widow would marry a close male relative of her now deceased husband. And the reason for this was to ensure that this woman still continued to have security and protection by being married. It would also ensure that the family line would not die out, that they would raise an heir, so to speak, of that now deceased first husband, that it would continue in their family line. But also, as importantly, we talked about so much of how God gave them this promised land. If there is not an heir of that land, that it was feeling like God was not keeping his promise. They did not have a peace that tied them back to what God had given to them. So it was a way for that land to still continue in the family as well. God caring for the widow, God caring for his people, God caring for his place that he has set them in, all of that captured in this idea. So what Naomi is saying to Ruth in this sentence is, you happen to go to this field that was owned by this man who is faithful when all else are doing what's right in their own eyes, who is kind and merciful to you in ways that surpassed what anyone could have possibly expected. But he also happens to be a redeemer, someone who, Ruth, he may marry you and give you a future, give you a home, give you security. Someone that may produce an heir for my late husband so his name does not die out. Someone who will keep this piece of land that my husband owned as part of the family. I mean, what are the chances indeed? But Ruth makes it very clear that she does not think this is happenstance. She does not see this as coincidence. And it really seems like the author of this book wants us to make that same connection as well by using the word happened. Ruth is a book that we don't often hear from or even about God throughout it. And yet we see his hand. We see his work constantly throughout this book, all showing us that God was and is and forever will be working in this world to bring satisfaction, fulfillment for his people. It's not a coincidence. In this time that's utterly horrific, when Naomi has experienced more loss than people will in a lifetime, when this world is falling apart around them and their lives have already fallen apart, God is working, always kind, never forsaking his people. And often we see it in events like we read in the story. There's no monumental, massive work that God does here. There's no supernatural occurrence that we can read about like we have in the previous books of the Bible, where we've been working through the Old Testament storyline and we see God guide his people by speaking to them directly. We see God care for his people by giving them victory against all odds. We see God removing any doubt as to where he wants his people to go by showing up in these incredible ways, by doing these miraculous works. And here in Ruth, we read of nothing like that. But it speaks to how God is most often working. And if I could put it this way, it is often in the mundane. It's in the ordinary. It's in the faithful acts that he does that are so easy for us to not attribute to him or miss that they're happening even around us. He's working in these ways that seem small in comparison, but are massive in the way God is working through his people. Because where God has worked in these incredible ways before, in this story we see him work in the small way of providing a meal for 2 widows, for calling for a law to show mercy to people, to ending a famine, which allows a woman who just lost her husband to come back home. See, when we read through the book of Ruth, there's so much in the story that's foreign to us. A deal is about to get made where people exchange sandals. That's strange. There's concepts all throughout that feel really foreign to us. A woman's utter dependence on having a man. This concept of levirate marriage, having a good relationship with your in-laws. So much of it is different than our culture. And yet, when we read through the book of Ruth, it speaks very much so aligned with our time. Because in a world that's full of pain and suffering and despair all around us, well, God is working. When we feel aimless and lost, well, God is working. When it feels like we've been left on our own, empty-handed, God is working. When we long for the days of old that God would speak directly to his people, when he would perform the loud, the clear, the miraculous, what we actually have is something greater. The certainty that there's never a place, never a time when God has stopped working. See, wherever it is that God happens to have you, well, that is where he's working through you and for you. And it may be in these small ways like we read about in the story, this ordinary means of giving us what we need, of a small act that's done in our life that we could easily overlook. or the sending of someone when we're in difficult circumstances so we don't have to bear them alone, or the mercy that God works through to provide care for us. Whatever it might be, God is working as much now as he always has been and always will be. Well, we continue the story in chapter 3, where Ruth and Naomi put together this plan to see, will Boaz be this redeemer? Will he be the one to provide security and comfort for these two widows? Will he do this work to redeem? And so Naomi primarily puts together a plan to see, will he extend his mercy even more? And so Ruth goes some night later, we're not entirely sure, to ask him of this. Will he be this one to redeem? And it's hard to understand. There's parts of it that are foreign to the point that some people read really scandalous details into the story of chapter 3, which the text just doesn't allow or support. But the end result of it is what's significant. Boaz is asked, will you be this redeemer? And essentially his answer comes down to, I will protect you. I will give you security, a home, a future. I will redeem you. One small problem, though, I'm actually not the closest relative. Someone else has more of a right to redeem you. And so I will go on your behalf, Ruth, to see, will this person step up? And so he goes out to the gate, which was a common meeting place, but never knowing, is this person going to show up or not? I'll wait for them to see, will they arrive? And wouldn't you know it, this more close relative shows up that very day. What are the chances? Well, Boaz brings this idea to this person to see, will they be this redeemer? And while we're not fully sure why, it's dangerous to speculate as to the reason why. This person says no, and so Boaz says yes. Maybe it is that they weren't tremendously interested in raising someone else's heir rather than his own, or didn't want to marry a Moabite like Ruth, which would have been their enemy, and so that would be understandable. But for whatever reason, this person says no, and so Boaz says yes, and marries Ruth and gives her this future. So there we have it. That's the story of Ruth. It's incredibly simple to tell. And like we said, there's not really monumental pieces to hang our hat on. There's no parting of a sea. There's no loud voice from God. There's no wars to be won in this. It's really ordinary. But what's monumental of the story is what it shows us God is doing even in those ordinary times. It is a simple story to tell, but monumental in understanding it. That God shows mercy to these widows. God works through the faithfulness of a man to extend even more mercy. God gives instruction to his people to care for themselves and those around. God gives a future to these women who were without. All throughout the story, we see God's hand in providing fullness. And I think that more than anything else is what stood out to me as the special meaning of this special story in this time that I was reading through it. Because there's so many directions that we could take with the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters long, so if you're ever looking for something to read, it's pretty easy to read through. But it's 4 chapters long, and yet there's so many different directions we could take. There's so many application points that we can make in it. That we see that God works through the mercy of this man to extend mercy towards others. I mean, how often can we think of what might God do through me to care for the people he cares about? How might we be like Boaz and extend mercy out of our faithfulness to him? Or this idea that God is working through the ordinary means. How often do we overlook what God is doing? So how can we look back to see God's hand, which is always there? Or this closeness and attachment of people who are family or important people in our life. How can we be as devoted and supporting as Ruth is to Naomi? There's many different directions that we could take, but the piece that I think is so impactful in this current reading of Ruth is how God is constantly working to bring satisfaction, to bring fullness. I mean, we see that in the life of Ruth, who in the beginning of the story, she has nothing. She's lost her husband. She doesn't have a child with him. There's no sense of security. There's no support for her. There's no hope or a future ahead of her. Let alone the fact of the insecurity that comes from being a foreigner in a strange land, let alone a Moabite in Israel at this time. That is a dangerous place to be. And yet God is constantly working in her life to where at the end of the story, we find her married with a home, with a future, with a son. But more than anything else, we see this idea of fullness all throughout the story of Naomi, who as well begins the story with nothing. No longer having a husband, no longer having sons, has no grandchildren to support her, no close family to herself, all tied to her husband, but really no support system around her. No idea where her next meal is going to come from. It's to the point that when she goes back home, when she goes to Israel, the people recognize her. It's like, hey, Naomi's back. And her response at the end of chapter 1 is horrible to read. It's just so full of her pain and suffering. This is verse 20. She said to them, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? She says, don't call me Naomi. That means pleasant. Nothing's pleasant. There's nothing good. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, because that's where I'm at. I had so much in my life before, and now I have nothing. The Lord has left me empty-handed. In a book that speaks so little from or even about God, it just makes these words stand out all the more. God has done this to me. Now, I'm not apportioning blame to her in this. I can't imagine. I get upset even just imagining what she went through in this point. She's lost everything. She's gone through so much difficulty. I mean, how do you press on? How do you keep going in that place? Well, that's the end of chapter 1. The end of the next 3 chapters help to give a little bit of an answer to that question. Because at the end of chapter 2, after Ruth has spent this whole day out gleaning in the field and comes back with all this food, it uses an interesting word to describe it. It says that it's come back with all this food, enough to where they're satisfied. This woman who feels empty now has a bit of being satisfied. We get to chapter 3, and this plan is in place to see, will Boaz be this redeemer? But Boaz is not merely considering the future. His mercy is extended to right now. This is what we read at the end of chapter 3, starting in verse 16. It says, and when she, this is Ruth, came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. It's the exact word. It's very much so playing off of what we see Naomi say at the end of chapter 1. For this woman who felt empty, at the end of this chapter we see she must not stay that way. Then we get to the end of the story, and we see the fullness that's given to Naomi there. This is verse 14. It says, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher. There's so many words of fullness here of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child into her hands and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. This woman who begins the story feeling empty, feeling without, ends the story with so much fullness. This woman who said that she was empty-handed, had nothing to grasp onto, at the end of the story is holding on to this child who is her certainty, her security, her future. This woman who goes from having nothing at all is looking around her and seeing nobody, is reminded at the end that she has this daughter-in-law who is worth more to her than 7 sons, and her love and care and support for her is the story of God giving her fullness. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. It's not as though it's a story of, well, Naomi lost some people, but she's got some new people at the end of the story, so all is fair and square. No, human beings can never be replaced. She will never get back what she lost before. But this is a story that we see God working through a broken world, a world that's full of pain and despair, a world that's so utterly broken by sin that there's not a place you can go to. It creeps into every nook and cranny. This world that we are in, that we can often say, this is not what it should be. That's correct. It's not what it should be. And sin impacts every single part of it, and yet God does not leave it on its own. God does not leave us in our own, but works throughout human history to bring about fullness for his people. And we see that in the life of Naomi. But there's one more piece of fullness that I see in this story. And it comes as we remember that it takes place in the time of Judges. That was summarized, as we read at the end of Judges, as being this time where there is no king, and so everyone just did what was right in their own eyes. There's a time of rebellion, of turning away from God, of doing what they think is best, and it ends up in chaos. And there's this longing in this phrase. Maybe you can hear it. If we only had a king. If we only had a leader who could point us back to God. If we only had someone who could be strong while these judges are not. If we only had someone who can guide us back to him, then we could have been spared all the atrocities, all the tragedies that take place in the book of Judges. Well, I cruelly cut off the verse a little too early when I was reading it earlier. Because it's from this marriage that God puts together of Boaz and Ruth. And they have this son named Obed. And Obed would eventually have a son named Jesse. And Jesse would have many sons. One of them was named David, who became the most important king in Israel's history. This longing of a nation fulfilled in a very small, very simple story. See, Ruth is a story of God bringing fulfillment, satisfaction, meeting the longings of his people. In the small, seemingly insignificant, faithful act of a man, in a difficult time, God saved 2 widows. In the patient, seemingly mundane work of God, he helped one to not feel empty anymore. In the small, everyday events of people's lives, God puts together a family that would birth a mighty king. And all this in a small, insignificant town in Israel. This little town called Bethlehem. See, it's from this family, from the line of a king, that in that same small, insignificant town, God does the greatest act in human history. He came into this world. This God who is always working to meet the needs of his people, to bring fulfillment, to satisfy longings, comes so that we might find all that we need in him. Because from the same town of Bethlehem, from this same family comes the ultimate source of fulfillment, this man, Jesus. This Jesus who constantly through his teaching, constantly through his work is calling people, come to me, because in me you find fulfillment. In me you find all that you're longing for. No matter what's going on in life, in me you find satisfaction. He says, abide in me to his people. For in him we have life and fullness and fruitfulness and flourishing. This Jesus who calls for us to turn to him whenever we are overwhelmed with despair. All who are weary, come to Jesus and find rest. This Jesus who says to those who are burdened that he takes that from us and gives us his lightness to bear. This Jesus who says his grace is sufficient for you. His power is proved such in our weakness, our shortcomings, our lacks when we feel empty. There's Jesus in whom, no matter what we face in this world, is our strength. This Jesus who is this true place of satisfaction, who fulfills our longing. And so my question for you this morning is, what are you longing for? What does it feel like there's a lack of in your life? Where does it feel like you are empty-handed? Maybe it's a future that you've longed for so long, but it just seems way too far off now. Maybe you're tired of resumes and applications, just longing for a job. Or not even that, something that makes you feel purposeful in this world, that gives you meaning. Maybe it's a family, or treatment, or just not to feel so lonely. And try as you might to feel pleasant, like a Naomi, everything just leaves a bitter Mara taste. And so the hurts that we feel, the scars that we still bear, the disappointments that feel like they're stacking up and up and up, it just feels like nothing can satisfy. Turn to this Jesus, who was and is and forever will be working in the large, obvious moments that we can overlook, or the mundane, seemingly insignificant moments that we just don't take notice of. God always has done and will do the work to satisfy those who are longing, fill those who are empty, and turn all that's bitter to be pleasant once again.
Thanks for joining us for our series By Faith. If you found this video helpful, click the like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps more people discover resources like this from Calvary Bible Church. You can learn more about us at calvarybible.com, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.